This is going to seem incredibly lazy, but really it's just practical. I do most of my rain wildlife photography from indoors because it keeps me dry and it helps provide some bit of a blind for me so the animals aren't quite as aware of my presence. And, you know, if I'm dry and comfortable, that means I'm going to be more likely to stay in the same spot and take a bunch of pictures. So it is actually really easy to get birds near your window so you can get close to them. And in fact, I often need an extension tube just so I can focus so closely. Just put some bird feeders near your window and maybe set up a tree or a few branches so the birds can land. Because you don't want to photograph the birds at the feeder. Instead, you want them to take the food and go land someplace photogenic. Let's go outside. If you do decide to venture into the rain, a few drops aren't going to kill your gear, but try to keep it as dry as possible. They do make rain covers that can cover even telephoto lenses. And honestly, if I just wipe away a few drops in a light rain, that's going to be fine. Where rain starts to become a problem is when there are enough drops that they all collect together and start to run down the camera, because it's those streams of rain that will move inside between the cracks and the seals and actually cause problems. But a few drops that get regularly wiped away shouldn't be an issue. Make sure that you use a lens hood on the camera. The hood is going to protect the front element from getting drops. Now, raindrops aren't going to do any damage to the front element, but they will ruin your pictures. And I found in the field it's really hard for me to completely clean it. So even just getting a couple of drops will pretty much mean it's the end of the day for me. Let's go talk about camera settings. I'll usually do wildlife photography in shutter priority mode, but when it's raining, it's definitely going to be dark enough that I'm going to be shooting wide open. And I don't want the camera to sometimes shut down the aperture, which it will. So I'll switch into manual mode and set the aperture to be wide open. ISO is always auto ISO, and it's going to be dark, so that ISO is going to go up. But don't let that freak you out. Yeah, there's going to be noise in your pictures, but using a lower ISO isn't going to reduce that noise. It's just going to give you darker, underexposed pictures. So it's best just not to think about it. Now, the shutter is really important when it's raining, because the shutter controls how much of the movement of those raindrops you're going to see. And if you're shooting at 1/2000th of a second, it's going to freeze those raindrops, and they're just going to appear to be a really small spot in the frame, and that doesn't carry any of the drama. It doesn't convey the feeling of the rain. Longer shutter speeds will show the raindrop, and the longer the shutter speed, the longer the raindrop is going to be. How long they are, there's no one right answer to this. It's going to depend on the magnification, like how far away the subject is, as well as how telephoto your lens is. So I always do a little bit of experimentation. I'll start at 1/500th of a second and just work my way down, focusing at a distance about where I hope the subject is going to be. You'll know the shutter speed is too long when the raindrop starts to disappear. And that's because it's just not reflecting enough light at any one point to really appear. So for me earlier, with 840 full frame millimeters here and some stabilization and yet dark conditions, I settled on 1/250th of a second as sort of the ideal compromise between getting my ISO as low as possible, showing as much of that raindrop as possible, and not having to worry about getting too much camera shake or having the raindrops disappear. I approached this cardinal as I would any other small songbird. I took some pictures of it from a distance. I looked at the various branches and how they might be obstructing my shot and tried to find a path that would keep my angle on the bird as clear as possible. I took maybe 100 shots every few steps because I knew the closer I got, the better and sharper that picture was going to be. Of course, you always want to get as close as possible, but at some point you're going to get so close that the bird is going to leave. Inevitably, that is what happened, but because I took shots all along the way, I was able to just use the last set of shots when I was as close as I was ever going to get. I used a continuous shutter. And with this Alpha 1, that's going to be 20 or 30 frames per second, kind of depending on the conditions. That gave me a lot of options to choose from. In the end, I took more than 1,000 photos of this cardinal, but there was one, just one, where the bird had its head in just the right position, where I thought it was the most attractive, where it fit the composition the best, and where it got a little catchlight in the eye. So don't be afraid to take a lot of shots. Like, they're easy to delete later, but you can't ever go back and necessarily recreate these rare situations. As always, when I'm shooting, my goal is to capture as much of the scene as possible and leave myself many options for post-processing. Indeed, post-processing really made a huge difference here because those photos didn't capture the feeling of the rain. Like, it did capture the rain, but it was pouring much more heavily than it felt like in that frame, because most of the raindrops would have disappeared into the background bokeh or fallen out of the frame. So I feel like I better captured it by stacking multiple images together. Let's go in the dry, warm studio and I'll show you how to do that. Oh, before I do, if you want to learn lots of techniques for wildlife photography, check out our book, Stunning Digital Photography, which has detailed information about all these techniques about setting up a wildlife studio in your own backyard, as well as tons of videos, practices, and quizzes. Thanks. I took more than 1,000 pictures with my borrowed Alpha 1 and this $13,000 lens. So how do I sort through those without wasting a ton of time in front of the computer? Well, I know I was moving closer and closer to the subject, so I can start at the very end. And I'm going to start by just looking at the thumbnails. I want them at a moderate size here because in the online world in 2021, this is how most people decide whether or not they want to explore a picture further, is by looking at a small version of this. So I'm looking for the general overall shape and things like the head position before I start looking at the details. And so I kind of scroll through and, just looking at the thumbnails, like these pictures here with the dead on, like that's not going to be a good picture. It's much more appealing with the bird in the profile like here. So once I decide on which pose I want, then I will zoom in to usually 200%, just so I can really see all of the details. And then I scroll through and mark each picture with 1 star or 2 star. This is just my first level of calling. If a picture is sharp and there's nothing wrong with it, then it gets 2 stars. And then afterwards I go through and I filter just the 2-star photos. If you want to know more about this, you can check out my Lightroom Classic book. We still prefer Lightroom Classic over standard Lightroom, and it's really inexpensive and includes a ton of really educational training videos that will save you so much time. So after I find the ideal picture with the right head position and a ton of sharpness, I'm going to mark that one with maybe 4 stars and give it a pick so I can find it easily later. But in this particular example, I'm not going to edit just that one photo. Instead, I'm going to pick a group of photos all around it that each got 2 stars and bring those into Photoshop as layers. So in this particular example, shooting rain, 10 photos is a pretty good amount of photos to have. I'll select those in Lightroom, select Edit In, and then select Open as Layers in Photoshop. So now all the layers are loaded into Photoshop. I'm going to select all the layers down here in the Layers panel. Click the first one, Shift click the last one, and then I'm going to go to Edit and Auto Align Layers. Now, I was hand holding this photo, so I moved a little bit between shots. In the Auto Align Layers panel, I'm going to select Vignette Removal and Geometric Distortion and then leave the projection on Auto. Photoshop will manage to align those as if I had the camera on the tripod. And that means there's going to be some bits around the edges that I'm going to have to crop off. So now the layers are neatly aligned. What I'm going to do is go through and find my one photo that's going to become my main photo. And I labeled that main just so I would be able to find it later. Now for all those other aligned photos, what I'm going to do is erase everything except the raindrops. So all I'm going to see is all the raindrops from all 10 photos, plus the bird and background from my main photo. This is super easy to do once you know this trick. First, I'll select the top layer here, and then I'm going to enable a layer mask. The layer mask is a way of just hiding or showing parts of the picture. And you can see this entire layer mask is white right now, but if I were to paint something black, that part of the picture would disappear. So I'm going to press B to select my brush and make sure that the brush here is black. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hide some of the raindrops. And this seems counterintuitive, right? Like I'm supposed to be showing the raindrops, but I just find this the easiest way to do it. Now notice that my brush here is moderately sized, a little bit bigger than the raindrops, and it has a nice soft edge. Not too soft, not too hard. This will help them blend together nice and smooth. So let's erase a few more raindrops. And now I'm going to select the layer mask and then I'm going to invert it. I do this on a Mac by pressing Command I. But you can also go to the menus here and do Image, Adjustments, and Invert. So now that the layer mask is inverted, everything that I hid is now the only thing that's visible. So by hiding those raindrops now, I've hidden everything except those raindrops. To make it blend a little bit nicer, I can also change the masking from normal to lighten because all of the raindrops are a little bit lighter. Now I'll hide that top layer and go to the next layer and repeat that process. Make the layer mask, mask out all of the raindrops, and then invert the layer mask. I repeated that process for all the layers, and now you can see I have 10 times the raindrop, and it better captures my experience of the situation since one frame can't capture very much rain at all. Now there's a little more processing I can do. Of course I had to shoot this at a high ISO because it was very dark. The camera wasn't getting much light and thus there's a lot of noise. I could easily crank up the noise reduction and eliminate all that noise, but it would also reduce the sharpness of the bird. What I really want here is some intelligent processing. I want to separate the foreground and the background. So to make this simple, and instead of having to work with a lot of layers, I'm just going to flatten the image. You could put it into a group. You could save the layered image as a backup file, but for the simplicity of this example, I'm going to flatten it. And now I'm going to separate the bird from its background. This is super easy in the latest versions of Photoshop. Do select and then subject. And this is actually probably good enough for me, but if you need to refine it, go to select and then select and mask. Use the select and mask tool to adjust the selection so only your bird is selected. Now I'll scroll down to the bottom here, do output 2, and I want new layer with layer mask. And I'll click OK. So now I have a layer with the bird and a layer with the background. Let's rename this to make it easy. What I actually like to do is to completely remove the subject from the background. This makes it a little bit easier to actually blur out things that aren't the main subject, and it prevents a little bit of fringing from happening. I'll show you what I mean. So I'm hiding the foreground there, and I'm going to apply the mask to my selection. So once again, I have just the bird selected. Now I'm going to select the background layer, and you know what, I'm going to make it a little bit wider. I'm going to do select, modify, expand, and let's expand it by 4 pixels is good. And so now I'm going to delete the bird from the scene. I'm going to do edit and then content aware fill. And I can make adjustments to where it's pulling information from. So now I can turn the bird on and off, and this allows me to apply different edits to both the subject, the bird, and the background. The biggest thing I could do is apply massive amounts of noise reduction to the background without worrying about the sharpness. So with the background only selected, I can do filter, noise, and then reduce noise. There's no one right answer here. I always try to use the least amount of noise reduction possible, but at the same time I want it to look good. But because there's no subject here, I don't have to worry about preserved details, so I can set that all the way down. And I can use a really pretty high strength to make it nice and smooth. And I don't need to sharpen the details at all, so I'll turn that off completely. And so now if I zoom in here, I shouldn't see any noise visible, but I also haven't lost any details from the bird. Let's go into the history so I can see the before and after. Before, after. If I want to, I can now apply changes only to the bird. I might want to add a little bit of sharpening, for example. Filter, sharpen, sharpen. There are several different sharpening tools you can use, but you can get the idea. I could also make very gentle edits to, say, the levels or the colors. For example, if I wanted to make the background a slightly different color, I could select just the background and then adjust the hue here. I could lower the saturation, not enough to make it selective color, but just enough to make it pop just a little bit more. And when I'm happy with all my changes, I can close this and bring it back into Lightroom and do my final round of editing. For me, a shot in the rain like this really calls for amplifying the mood a little bit. I want to make it feel cool and calm. Chelsea made some presets that you can get on our website at northrup.photo. And I really like them, especially the autumn set. So I like to just scroll through here and see the different looks I can achieve. I think of it as more a starting point, like inspiration. And you can see with this same photo, the different presets create such dramatically different looks. And of these, I think the one that really moves me is Moonlight, because it sort of shifted the green background to this very cool color, and I like the way the Cardinal's red body complements and contrasts that cool blue. But at the same time, it was a little bit too extreme, a little bit too contrasty. So I'm going to apply that preset, and then I'm just going to raise the shadows a little bit so I can see the eye a little bit more, and maybe go in and change these colors a little bit. Like, I don't need to lower the saturation or the luminance of the Cardinal. I want it to be nice and bright, so I'm going to brighten that back up. Presets are just a starting point, and if any of this is losing you, again, we have books on Lightroom and Photoshop. You can see just how dramatically they can change your photography. And if you're stuck inside anyway in this winter, why not spend some time actually learning to improve your photos while you sit at a computer in a nice warm environment. I'm really happy with the final output. Let me know what you think of it. I also shared it on my Twitter and Instagram, so be sure to follow me there. And also, subscribe to this channel. We have lots more tutorials coming, as well as more reviews about cameras like this amazing Sony Alpha 1 and this 600mm f4. Thanks so much. Bye.